This weekend, my best friend in another state decided to request Fruit Loop cake that he can't even eat himself, and of course, I made it. I took Christina Tosi's Momofuku milk bar cake and kind of winged it into a Fruit Loop cake. I used some advice from Sugar and Sparrow's website. She has a recipe for Fruit Loop cake actually, so let's go. Sugar and Sparrow recommended to use milk cereal as a way to add flavor. So I just took the measured amount of milk and added Fruit Loops and let it soak for about 15 minutes. And that's how I got the cereal milk that added some flavor into the cake. So we're starting with cake flour. This has lower protein content, which makes the cake nice and fluffy and tender. And then we're going in with baking powder, salt, and mixing that up. And I'm kind of winging it this time, so it is a bit more chaotic and also a bit more fun that way, just sort of making things up as you go. So I'm gonna add some softened butter. I just softened it a bit in the microwave because it's important for creaming properly that it's soft. And I added a little bit less sugar because a lot of the Momofuku reviews said that it was an extremely sweet cake, and I didn't want it to be cloyingly sweet because the Fruit Loops also add a lot of sweetness. So I lowered the amount of white sugar, and then now I'm adding some shortening. I stuck to the rest of the cake measurements because I didn't want to get too crazy. I did want to try to stick to that recipe and see how it came out. So I'm straining out the cereal out of the milk and squeezing out any excess, and I will say I did eat the cereal out over the sink like an animal, and I didn't feel bad about it. Now I'm adding white vinegar to the milk to turn it into some faux buttermilk because that's what the recipe called for, and I didn't have any buttermilk, and this works just fine. And then now I am going to grind up some Fruit Loops in the food processor into fine crumbs, which was another tip from Sugar and Sparrow because she said they do get soggy if you just put whole Fruit Loops into the cake, which is exactly what I was planning on doing. So I listened to her and made them into crumbs. And I would add more crumbs than I did. I just translated the this is just me being excited and not knowing what I'm doing next. All right, gather your thoughts. I would add more Fruit Loop crumbs than I did. So you can see here the milk turned coagulated and it's good to go because of the vinegar. And now I'm going to measure in the oil, and it was so satisfying. It was exactly the amount of oil that I needed, which was nice. And this cake does have a lot of fat in it. It has the butter, vegetable shortening, and oil, so it didn't come out as rich as I'd expected with this amount of fat. It was very light and fluffy. So I'm starting to cream the butter, sugar, and shortening, and you can see because it's such a small amount, I had to scrape the bowl a bunch of times to make sure that mixture was getting mixed properly. But that's okay, just make sure you're aware of it and doing that to make sure it comes out properly. And I did set a timer to cream it for as long as the recipe said to make sure it was light and fluffy, and you can see the colors changing as I am creaming. So I'm just going to keep doing this, give it a lot of scrapes, and now it's time to add the eggs, and this is where it started getting a little crazy. So my eggs were at room temperature, but as I added the eggs, the mixture started breaking, and you can see it's kind of chunky and separated. So I'm not sure what happened there. I just kept rolling with it. At this point I was fully committed, so I just kept mixing it as it said and giving the bowl a lot of scrapes. But you can see as I'm adding them, the mixture is definitely broken, which is usually a no-no, and usually a sign that your eggs were too cold, so I would just definitely make sure they're at room temperature. It could have also been because I added a little bit less sugar, so the ratios of the emulsification could have been off. I'm not really sure what exactly caused it, but once I added the dry ingredients, it ended up being okay. You can see coming up, I did think the mixture had come back together as I kept mixing it, but when I lift the beaters out of the bowl, see, doesn't it look like it's together here? But when I lift them, you can tell it's definitely separated, which is okay. It ended up working out fine. The cake didn't have a weird reaction or something, so at least that worked out. And it did say to mix this part for like a few minutes, and you can see how much fluffier and lighter it got. So make sure you follow the recipe and do that. Mixing some air in, and I thought it came back together, but nope, it's still separated. Wah wah. That's okay. So now I'm going to start adding the wet ingredients, the buttermilk and oil and vanilla. I couldn't find the clear vanilla that she really says to use for that artificial birthday cake flavor, but that's okay because I kind of wanted the Fruit Loop flavor anyways, so maybe it worked out better with regular vanilla. Now I added the dry ingredients and I mixed that just till it was combined because I didn't want it to get tough due to gluten development. I wanted the cake to stay nice and tender. So I mixed the rest by hand. And here I'm just struggling to scrape the beater as usual, and I just switched to my fingers because it's faster and nobody has time to stand there scraping for 5 minutes. So I'm just going to give this a good last mix, make sure there's not anything stuck at the bottom of the bowl. And Christina Tosi said to bake in a sheet pan. Oh, here I'm just giving the batter a try, and I added about half a cup total of crumbs. I would say to add about 3/4 to a cup of Fruit Loop crumbs to make the flavor a bit stronger. Mine had flavor, but I could have done with a little bit more. So if I were you, I would add a little more. But yeah, returning to the pans, I didn't have a 6-inch cake ring to assemble the cake in, so I decided to just bake in my regular 9-inch cake pans, and that way I could assemble the cake properly without that equipment that she asked for. And it ended up being fine. I just spread the batter out, and I was having quite a bit of fun with this. I was using these little motions to get it into the corners, and it's like having way too much fun. So then I'm just gonna give the pans a little smack down on the counter to get the air bubbles out, make sure it's settled in, and then those went in the oven for about 30 minutes, I would say, but I baked mine a little bit too long because could have been a little more moist. I think I baked them for about 5 minutes too long, so just keep an eye on that. And now I moved on to the crumbs. I did add a little bit less sugar, similar to the cake batter, because I didn't want it to be cloyingly sweet. And I'm not sure what caused it, but the cake crumbs did have a bit of a bitter aftertaste. I can't put my finger on it. They just had some sort of aftertaste. I'm not sure if it's because the only wet ingredients in this were oil. The crumbs were really good. I'm just not sure. I couldn't put my finger on what gave it that aftertaste, but once eaten with the whole cake, it came out fine. It was just something I noticed. So here I'm adding in a bunch of more Fruit Loop crumbs. I couldn't really decide how much to add because I did want it to have Fruit Loop flavor. So I gave it a mix, and then I thought it should have more. I kind of already had these ground up, so I sort of just threw them in there. And Yeah, I wouldn't say I put too much Fruit Loop in anything, so I think the more the better. And I mixed that up, and then I added the oil. And this was really fun to mix together. You could, if you have kids, this is going to be so fun for them. And then I made sure that was all the flour was hydrated and spread that out. And you can turn it into big crumbs, little crumbs, however you like. I think the big crumbs look better on the cake, so I could have done with a little bit more big crumbs, but it was good either way. And then now I'm putting together some more cereal milk, and this is when I pulled the cake out. It looked really soft, so I wasn't sure if it was fully baked, but you can tell from the sides they are coming away from the pan. And as I said earlier, could have baked a little less. And then this is the crumbs halfway through baking. Um, and now onto the frosting, and this is where I went the most rogue, I would say. I do not like buttercream whatsoever, so I just went with all cream cheese, but I stuck with the rest of the frosting ingredients that she had, and oh, I guess I really wanted to show you what the cake crumbs looked like when I took them out. All right, so that's what they looked like. They solidified more as they cooled down. And yeah, the frosting recipe called for corn syrup, which I don't have, but I did have glucose syrup. And I'm not sure if the glucose reacted weird with the cream cheese. The frosting recipe also called for baking powder, which intrigued me. I didn't know what it would do, so I still added that. And the frosting ended up coming out really loose, different from my normal cream cheese frosting texture that everyone knows. I also added the lemon juice and salt, which I would say definitely doesn't need salt if you're doing cream cheese frosting. Um, but yeah, I followed everything else, which obviously would come out different than if I had used butter and shortening, like she said. Um, and the frosting, yeah, just had a weird texture. It didn't really want to set up, as you'll see later on. But I kind of just went with it because I wanted to see what would happen, which is kind of part of the fun of baking anyways. It doesn't need to come out perfect every time. And, oh, the cake broke in half. Not all the way though, it was fine, don't worry about it. And now I'm straining out the Fruit Loops out of the milk and basting it, or not basting, but soaking the cake with a bit of that. I didn't use all the milk, but hers would have been a 3-layer cake, so that probably would have taken all the milk if you followed what she did. And you can see the frosting had been in the fridge for 45 minutes to an hour, and it was still really fluid. But that's okay. I was almost done at this point. So I went with it, and I added more Fruit Loop crumbs to the middle of the cake. I would say don't do this because they do just kind of get soggy. Luckily, I didn't add so much that it was like offensive to me. And oh, casting a spell on the cake or something. I don't know what that was. But yeah, don't add the Fruit Loop crumbs to the middle. It's not necessary. It doesn't add anything. Now I'm basting the second cake. I basted it until the crumbs started coming off, so I thought that was enough milk, and I didn't use all of it. And now I'm adding a very thin layer of frosting to the whole cake. This is called a crumb coat, and the purpose of it is to kind of catch all the crumbs that come off the cake so that once you do the rest of the frosting, the cake crumbs don't mix in and kind of taint the nice frosting layer that you have on the outside. So I do that, and then I stuck it in the freezer for about 20 minutes to set up, and then I did the rest of the cake. And make sure you don't use your spatula that you're spreading with into the rest of the frosting, because then you'll just get crumbs in all your frosting. So the liquid frosting kind of started seeping out of the middle layer, so I kind of just smoothed that out. Even though it was still coming out, I just kind of kept going at this point, and frosted the rest of the cake, and then stuck that back in the freezer for a bit and kind of fixed the sides again. It looked pretty good at this point, and I'm just going to top it with the rest of the cake crumbs, These were so good, despite that bit of an aftertaste. Probably the best part of the cake. They're so good. Um, and then I wanted a bit more color on the top, so I added some more Fruit Loop crumbs, and you can just do this however you like. You can stick the crumbs onto the side of the cake, you can do just the top, just however you like. And I was very excited to eat it at this point, but the recipe said to freeze it for at least 3 hours, which I patiently waited for. And then finally, it was the best part. So overall, I would say for a first attempt and for changing a bunch of things on the recipe, this came out pretty well, maybe like a 7 out of 10. The cake did probably overbaked for about 5 minutes, so if you do the correct amount of time, it would have come out even better. It was very light and fluffy. It's not a moist, dense cake, it's a tender one. Um, the frosting, just do regular cream cheese or follow her buttercream ratio, but don't do this weird Frankenstein that I did. It was still very good. The crumbs were delicious and added a nice textural element, and it did have a pretty good Fruit Loop taste. It could be even stronger if you add more crumbs to the cake, and look at this, I just noticed. It's hanging on. But yeah, let me know if you try this out. It was really fun to make and quite an experience.